Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It began in winter, the kind of cold that slows breath, stiffens thought, and makes even silence feel suspicious. Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. A small village resting uneasily at the edge of the known world. Life was hard, God was strict, and neighbors knew each other's business as intimately as their own prayers. It was meant to be a city upon a hill, a beacon of moral purity. Instead, it became a place where fear wore scripture as a mask and suspicion grew faster than crops ever could. What destroyed Salem was not witchcraft. It was isolation, faith, and exhaustion colliding in one fragile community. To understand how it happened, you have to understand the world the Puritans built. They were not evil. They were earnest, convinced they were building heaven's outpost. But freedom for them meant the freedom to be stricter than anyone else. Their dream hardened into rules so rigid that laughter was suspect, color was vanity, and individuality looked like rebellion. Salem itself was already divided. The wealthier town near the coast and the poorer, farming village inland. The village worked rocky soil and fought off cold, so every loaf of bread and every sermon felt like survival. That closeness bred both cooperation and resentment. Missed church once, and people noticed. Missed twice, and people whispered. Their sermons painted life as a constant battle between God and the devil. Every lost crop or sick child seemed proof that Satan's hand was near. Massachusetts, meanwhile, had lost its royal charter. The government was shaky. Ministers warned that divine wrath was coming. Salem was a pressure cooker sealed by faith, heated by fear, waiting for one spark. And fear always finds its language. The Puritans did not see the devil as metaphor. They believed he was a physical presence lurking in the forest beyond the village. Imagine living like that. No lights after sunset, only the creak of wood and wind, believing salvation depended on spotless behavior. In a world where imagination itself was forbidden, small oddities could feel supernatural. For years, life had been an endless cycle of chores, guilt, and prayer. Even joy was rationed. So when two girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began shaking and screaming, it shattered more than quiet. It shattered certainty. If the devil could touch the minister's own family, no one was safe. At first, people looked for a practical cause. The doctor found none. Religion stepped in. "This is the devil's work," he said, and the word spread faster than illness. Panic always disguises itself as logic. Once fear is named, every detail starts fitting the story. The girls' fits and whispers became evidence. Fear needs an enemy, and Salem had plenty of candidates. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, was different in color and custom. Sarah Good was poor, a beggar muttering to herself. Sarah Osborne was sick and skipped too many sermons. Their lives had already broken Salem's invisible rules. Accusing them made the town feel righteous again. Looking back, it is easy to mock the superstition, but to them it made sense. When the world feels random, blaming someone restores order. Salem was not possessed. It was terrified. The villagers were not monsters. They were trying to survive meaninglessness, faith, fear, and fatigue that was the real unholy trinity. The late 1600s had brought war rumors, disease, and crop failures. People were exhausted, and exhaustion craves simplicity. In a theology where nothing happens without purpose, disaster must mean guilt. Someone must have opened the door to evil. The witch trials did not invent paranoia. They gave it secret permission. Neighbors who once prayed together now watched each other. Old grudges bloomed into divine missions. A lost cow or spoiled milk became the devil's signature. The witch trials began not as cruelty, but as an attempt to fix what was broken, to prove to heaven that Salem was still pure. But salvation through accusation never ends. Once the first name is spoken, there is always another. By then, darkness had seeped into every corner. The only light came from candles, their smoke staining ceilings black. Children were raised to fear disobedience more than death. Women were taught that silence was strength. Men equated virtue with control. Isolation, monotony, and repression fermented together. When joy is denied long enough, the mind invents drama. In that silence, hysteria was almost a relief movement after years of stillness. The panic did not erupt from nowhere. It was the only excitement they would had in years. Every mass panic has a structure. In Salem, it was simple. First, a strange event, unexplained behavior, amplified by authority. Second, a belief system that rewards certainty over doubt. Third, leaders who gain importance through fear. And finally, an audience desperate for meaning. Once those align, hysteria becomes self-sustaining. The more you accuse, the safer you feel. The louder you believe, the holier you appear. It is not ancient psychology. The same dynamics drive rumor spirals today, just with different altars. Witch trials had burned across Europe for centuries, but Salem's story cut deeper because it was homegrown. No king decreed it, no invaders pushed it. It was neighbors turning on neighbors, convinced they were saving souls. They shared bread one day and suspicion the next. That intimacy made betrayal intimate too. The woods, pressing close around the village, added to the claustrophobia. News travelled only by word, reshaped each time. A rumour, without paper or proof, can sprint faster than truth ever will. Hysteria works like weather. Pressure and heat meet still air, and a storm forms. For years, Salem's sky had been grey with waiting. Religion was the air, poverty the cold, exhaustion the wind. The witch trials were not lightning out of nowhere. They were thunder after long silence. And like storms, they passed, but not before flooding everything. So when we talk about Salem, we are not really talking about witches. We are talking about how ordinary people can mistake fear for righteousness. We are talking about how loneliness and faith mixed with pride can turn mercy into violence. The trials that followed the courts, the hangings, the prayers whispered under ropes were only the aftershock. The real story begins before the first accusation, in a quiet village where everyone already suspected everyone else of something. A grey sky, a cold church, 2 frightened children, and a community ready, almost eager, to believe that the devil had finally come to town. It started quietly, almost like a whisper behind closed doors. In the winter of 1692, inside Reverend Samuel Parris's small parsonage, 2 girls began to act in ways no one could explain. 9-year-old Betty Parris, the minister's daughter, and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, his niece, were suddenly gripped by fits that looked nothing like illness. They screamed, convulsed, and spoke of invisible creatures clawing at their skin. At night, their cries echoed through the wooden walls of the parsonage, carrying fear straight into the hearts of those who heard. Reverend Parris, a man already worried about his position in the village, saw not only his child suffering, but also his own reputation trembling. If the devil could reach a minister's home, what did that mean for the rest of Salem? Within days, more girls began to display similar fits. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and several others. They fell to the floor in spasms, barked like animals, and claimed that ghostly figures tormented them. Their symptoms seemed to spread faster than any fever. The village searched for explanations. Some thought the girls were pretending. Others whispered about illness or bad spirits from the woods. But in a world where the supernatural was not symbolic but real, even doubt became dangerous. When the local doctor, William Griggs, could not find any physical cause, he uttered words that would turn a private family problem into a community-wide crisis. It must be witchcraft. That diagnosis was enough. It gave fear a name, and a name gave it power. The moment witchcraft entered the conversation, everything changed. The girl's suffering was no longer random. It was evidence. And Salem, desperate for order, was eager to listen. People began to visit the Parris home, hoping to see the afflicted girls with their own eyes. What they saw confirmed their worst beliefs. Trembling bodies, sudden screams, and accusations whispered through clenched teeth. Ministers prayed, neighbors gasped, and the room filled with the scent of smoke and dread. Each outburst fed the next, until the girl's behavior became the town's theater, part tragedy, part sermon. To modernize, it might look like hysteria or performance, but to the Puritans, it was proof that unseen forces had breached their walls. Their entire worldview depended on clear boundaries between good and evil. Now, those boundaries were blurred. If children could be attacked by invisible spirits, who had sent them? Who among them had invited the devil in? It is easy to underestimate the power of suggestion in a community where belief defines reality. The more the girls screamed, the more credible they became. Each fit drew new witnesses. Each witness carried the story further, and each retelling made it feel more true. Salem's imagination began to fill with shapes and shadows. At night, villagers saw strange lights in the forest. By morning, they remembered dreams of witches dancing around a fire. And yet beneath all that terror lay something simpler: attention. For months, these young girls had lived quiet, restricted lives, expected to obey and remain unseen. Now, suddenly, they were at the center of everything. Important men listened when they spoke. Crowds gathered to watch. Their words could send a shiver through the whole village. In that moment, they held a kind of power no child in Puritan Salem had ever tasted. That does not mean they invented the panic out of malice. It means hysteria can feel like release. For people, especially children trapped in a world that punished emotion, fear became their only permitted language. Every cry was both performance and confession, a way to express what had long been repressed. Once Reverend Parris accepted the doctor's verdict, he called other ministers to examine the girls. Their conclusion was unanimous. The devil was at work in Salem. Fasting and prayer were ordered, but the girls' fits only grew worse. They began naming names. The first were those who already stood on the edges of society: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. It made sense that evil would choose the weak and the different as its vessels. The accusations turned gossip into doctrine. What had begun as two frightened girls shaking in a small house now had the weight of heaven and hell behind it. Tituba's confession, under pressure and fear, gave the story its mythology. She spoke of a tall man in black, of strange animals, and a book with many names written inside. The villagers listened with wide eyes and trembling hands. Her words filled in the blanks of their terror, turning rumor into revelation. From that moment, the hysteria spread beyond control. Each claim birthed another, like sparks jumping from one roof to the next. Ministers preached about vigilance, parents watched their children for signs of the devil's touch, and ordinary disagreements began to look like dark alliances. The town had found its story, and everyone had a part to play. Salem no longer felt like a small, struggling settlement. It felt like a battlefield between God and Satan, played out in real time. The line between medicine and faith had vanished. The line between imagination and testimony followed soon after. The afflicted girls had become holy witnesses. Their screams carried authority, and their silence when it came was treated like prophecy. Even those who doubted learned to stay quiet. To question the girls was to risk suspicion. To hesitate was to look guilty. And so the entire community bent toward belief, not because it was certain, but because it was safer. Fear turned into a social currency. The more you displayed, the more protected you seemed. In just a few weeks, Salem shifted from superstition to system. What had begun in one household now dictated law. The parsonage that once echoed with prayer became the epicenter of chaos, a place where neighbors gathered to watch innocence burn under its own faith. The story of two children suffering had become the foundation for one of the darkest chapters in early American history. And that is how it always begins, not with villains, but with victims. Not with malice, but with meaning. Two girls, a frightened father, and a doctor searching for an answer gave shape to a nightmare that would consume an entire community. The spark was small, but the wood was dry. The first scream was the match, and once it caught, Salem would never be the same again. The fire that began in that parsonage did not stay contained. Word traveled across the snowbound fields, across the frozen river, down narrow dirt lanes where every house seemed to lean closer to listen. By the time spring thawed the ground, the entire village was awake and whispering. Children imitated the afflicted girls, collapsing in the streets, clutching at invisible hands. Adults whispered prayers and hurried home before dark. The normal rhythm of life, work, worship, sleep, was broken. Now every hour turned on rumor. The church bells tolled longer, sermons grew harsher, and every sound outside seemed to carry an omen. Mothers pulled their children close. Men spoke of building stronger fences, as if wood could keep out spirits. The girls were brought before ministers and questioned again. Each time, the room grew more crowded, the air heavier. They described visions of black shapes, of biting creatures, of cold fingers pressing against their throats. Their stories changed, grew, tangled, but no one dared to challenge them. To contradict a victim was to side with the devil. Fear has gravity. Once it begins to fall, it pulls everything else down with it. Salem's leaders, already uneasy about political turmoil in the colony, saw the panic as a test of faith. The more people feared, the more they could guide them back to righteousness, or so they told themselves. Reverend Paris preached fiery warnings about sin hidden within the community. Every misstep, every minor dispute now carried spiritual weight. Even the animals seemed uneasy. Farmers said their horses reared for no reason, that dogs barked at empty corners. The world itself appeared to be confessing. Then came the meetings. Small gatherings first, then larger ones. Neighbors huddled by candlelight to discuss who might be working with the devil. Old grudges resurfaced under holy names. If someone's cow had fallen sick, perhaps a witch had cursed it. If someone's child had recovered too quickly, perhaps they had help from dark powers. Accusation became a kind of community game, part justice, part survival. Those who accused loudly were seen as righteous. Those who stayed quiet drew stares. The afflicted girls, once pitied, were now revered. Their performances became almost ritual. They would enter a room, fall to the floor, and cry out that they saw a spirit standing near a specific person. That person, frozen in disbelief, would be seized and questioned. "Do you see this person tormenting you?" the judges would ask. "Yes," the girls would scream, convulsing, and so a new name joined the growing list. Each name gave the others more credibility. Each arrest confirmed the story. Within weeks, the jails built to hold a handful of petty thieves were overflowing with accused witches. Chains clanked, prayers echoed, and the air smelled of straw and sweat and fear. Husbands accused wives, children accused parents, friends turned against each other. To survive, people pointed elsewhere. "I saw her spirit," they would say. Or he signed the devil's book. Lies became lifelines. And yet, beneath all this terror, something deeply human was happening. The people of Salem were not possessed by evil. They were trying to make sense of chaos. For generations, they would have been told the world was a moral play, every event proof of divine justice. But what happens when that justice seems random? When the good suffer and the wicked prosper? It is easier to believe in witches than in unfairness. The witchcraft theory restored order. It said the world still makes sense if you look hard enough for the sinners. In that way, witchcraft was less a superstition than a social tool. It explained the inexplicable. It united people around a shared enemy. It allowed suffering to have a reason. Fear simplified the world. For a little while, that simplicity felt like peace. But hysteria is greedy. It demands more proof, more noise, more victims. The girls' accusations became wilder. They claimed to see flying shapes, spectral animals, ghosts in courtrooms. At one hearing, a girl screamed that an invisible bird pecked her neck. The crowd gasped, and the accused woman was dragged away before she could protest. Even the absurd felt rational once fear had rewritten the rules. Still, there were moments when doubt flickered. A few villagers began to whisper that perhaps the girls were acting, or that their fits looked rehearsed. One farmer, John Proctor, dared to call the girls frauds. But courage was costly. Soon his own wife was accused. To question the trials was to risk your life. The machinery of hysteria runs on silence. By late spring, the trials were in full motion. The court of Oyer and Terminer was formed, and its judges accepted the girls' visions as truth. The afflicted screamed, judges prayed, and the accused begged for mercy. Every hanging only fueled the next accusation. Salem's landscape changed. Gallows on the hill, weeping families below, a town praying louder to drown out its guilt. And yet, none of it would have happened without that first moment in the Paris house. Two children, frightened and confused, became the fuse for an entire society's stored fear. Their suffering, real or imagined, gave permission for everyone else to express their own. The girl's pain became the mirror of Salem's soul. As the months passed, the line between sincerity and performance disappeared. The girl's fits became predictable. The audience grew accustomed. They had learned the script of power. When they screamed, men listened. When they fainted, judges took notes. What had begun as panic now had choreography. But even that performance was a symptom of something deeper, the hunger to be seen in a world that silenced you. Children rarely hold power in repressive societies. In Salem, they found it through terror. Their words could imprison adults. Their gestures could end lives. It was intoxicating and deadly. But responsibility did not belong to them alone. The adults built the stage. The children only filled it. The ministers fed the panic. The courts formalized it, and the villagers sustained it. Everyone wanted the story to be true, because the alternative, that they were killing the innocent, was unbearable. As spring turned to summer, the hysteria reached its height. People who had once laughed at witch stories now crossed themselves when the wind changed. The night seemed alive with unseen movement. Crops failed, livestock died, thunder rolled. Every misfortune became a sermon. The devil's shadow stretched across every field, and in the center of it all stood the parsonage where the first screams had been heard. The small wooden house became a symbol, a shrine to fear. Visitors still came to watch the afflicted girls. Some came out of piety, some out of curiosity, others because they were afraid not to. Fear had become a form of belonging. To doubt was to stand alone. Eventually, even the afflicted seemed trapped by what they had started. They could not stop. The village would not let them. Each time the panic threatened to fade, someone demanded another confession, another name. The girls obliged. Their stories became grander, their theatrics more violent. And Salem kept believing, because belief had become easier than truth. That is how the spark from two frightened girls grew into an inferno. What began as a mystery of illness turned into an epidemic of accusation. The first cry was curiosity, the second self-defense, the third survival. The rest was momentum. Fear, once given a body, never rests until it devours its maker. By midsummer, Salem was unrecognizable. Markets stood half empty. Families were divided, and Gallows Hill loomed like a dark monument above the town. The ministers still preached, insisting that the trials were cleansing the community of sin, but the villagers' eyes told a different story: exhaustion, doubt, shame. Some began to realize that the devil had never been hiding in their neighbors. He had been hiding in their fear. The chain of events that began in that parsonage would continue to unravel for another year through confessions, trials, executions, and regret. But the seed was planted in those first days of confusion when a doctor said witchcraft, and everyone sighed in relief, believing they would find an answer. Salem's tragedy was not born of hatred, but of certainty. The people did not think they were doing evil. They thought they were saving their souls. That is what makes the story endure. It reminds us how fragile reason becomes when fear feels righteous. The witch hysteria did not erupt overnight. It crept in quietly, disguised as care, as faith, as duty. 2 children's cries became the language of an entire community's doubt. And once that language took hold, it spoke louder than truth ever could. By the time the last snow melted, the village that once feared the devil no longer needed him. They had become his voice. The parsonage windows still flickered with candlelight, but inside, the prayers had changed. They were no longer asking for protection from evil. They were asking for forgiveness for what they had unleashed. The moment the afflicted girls began to name names, Salem crossed an invisible line. What had been confusion became accusation. What had been fear became law. When asked who tormented them, the girls spoke with trembling certainty. They described shadowy women who pinched a bit and whispered in their dreams. It did not take long before 3 names surfaced, names already heavy with suspicion: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Each of these women carried a story that, in its own way, already marked her as guilty in the eyes of Salem. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, was an outsider in every sense. She was dark-skinned, foreign, and spoke of distant lands that the Puritans could only imagine. Her stories of spirits and omens, once harmless entertainment for the Parris children, now seemed dangerous. She had been kind to the girls, telling them small tales to pass the long, dull winter evenings. But when the girls began convulsing, those same stories turned into evidence that she had opened a door to the devil. Sarah Good lived on the margins of the village, poor and desperate. She wandered from house to house with her young child, begging for food or shelter. When people turned her away, she muttered under her breath. Those mutterings, more likely curses against hunger and shame, became, in the villagers' minds, proof of witchcraft. In a world where poverty was viewed as moral failure, Sarah Good's suffering was already a sin. Then there was Sarah Osborne, a sick and stubborn woman who had missed too many church services and fought publicly over inheritance. She had married a servant after her first husband's death, breaking the strict social code of Salem. To her neighbors, she was a woman who no longer respected divine order. 3 women. 3 easy targets. None had power, all were inconvenient. When the girls pointed toward them, the community sighed in collective relief. The enemy had faces now. The arrests happened in early March. Snow still covered the ground, and the air was thin with cold. Villagers gathered as the constable knocked on doors, dragging the accused through the streets. The crowd did not shout. They watched in silence, a kind of grim satisfaction flickering behind their eyes. The world made sense again for a moment. When the interrogations began, the fear in the meeting house was palpable. The magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, sat behind a wooden table, quills ready. The girls cried out from the benches, their voices sharp as wind. "There, she is hurting me." The accused women denied it, of course. But the more they protested, the more the girls screamed. Every movement was misread as guilt. Sarah Good tried to explain her poverty, her wandering, her anger. It did not matter. Her child was questioned. 2 little Dorcas, Good, barely 4 years old. Even the innocence of youth could not survive the fever. The child was pressured until she nodded. The court took it as confession. Sarah Osborne, frail and ill, could barely stand. She denied all charges, saying she had harmed no one. But the judges saw weakness as deceit. She was carried back to prison in chains, where sickness soon finished what the trials had begun. And then came Tituba, the most complicated figure in the story. She was brought before the magistrates last. The villagers expected a simple denial, but instead she told them what they wanted to hear. She spoke of a tall man in black, of books where witches signed their names, of strange animals, cats, birds, wolves, that carried out dark errands. Whether she believed any of it, or simply wanted to stop the shouting, no one can say. But her confession electrified the room. In that moment, the witch trials were born. Her story confirmed every suspicion, every sermon, every whispered fear. The devil was not just present, he had an organization. There were others, many others, hidden among them. The court demanded names, and Tituba gave them. The machine of hysteria roared to life. Her confession became the blueprint for dozens more. The structure was simple and irresistible. Admit guilt, accuse others, and live. Deny and die. From that day forward, confession meant survival. Denial meant the rope. Salem, which once valued honesty as sacred, now rewarded lies told in the right direction. Word of Tituba's confession spread faster than any proclamation. Ministers preached that the devil had infiltrated their midst. Ordinary people who had once felt powerless suddenly realized that accusation gave them influence. For the first time, being afraid became a kind of authority. Neighbors who had kept quiet about old grudges now found their chance. A cow that died last winter, a quarrel over land, a lost needle. Everything could be reinterpreted through the language of witchcraft. The accused were not just individuals anymore, they were symbols of evil. And so, by the end of March, Salem's prisons overflowed. The women were shackled together, their breath frosting the air in the dim light. The walls were damp, the floors cold. They prayed, cried, sometimes argued. Outside, the same villagers who had once traded with them now whispered curses as they passed. But in the silence between the prayers and the sobs, something more tragic settled in. None of these women had any hope of convincing the world of their innocence. The logic of hysteria had no reverse gear. If you denied guilt, you were stubborn. If you confessed, you were damned. If you accused others, you lived but at the cost of your soul. Tituba's testimony had also given Salem its story, a dark conspiracy beneath a holy surface. The ministers called it a divine test. The judges called it duty. The villagers called it justice. But beneath every word was fear, the fear that maybe, just maybe, this evil could not be stopped, and they were all complicit in letting it grow. Even the children of Salem felt its reach. They played witch in the fields, imitating the courtroom scenes they had overheard. They learned the new hierarchy of fear, who to trust, who to watch, and when to keep silent. In a society built on obedience, the witch panic had become the one thing that united everyone: priests, farmers, beggars, even children. Sarah Good was hanged that summer, still proclaiming her innocence. Her final words were bitter and fearless. "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard." Sarah Osborne died in jail before her trial ever began. Tituba, ironically, survived. She remained in prison for over a year before being sold to pay her jail fees. The one who confessed lived. The ones who held to truth perished. The village did not see this irony. Instead, it saw confirmation. The trials were working. They thought the witches were being revealed. In truth, the tragedy had only begun. The first accusations opened a door that would never fully close. Every time a woman swung from the gallows, the people below whispered prayers not for her soul, but for their own safety. Because once the system rewarded fear, no one could stand outside it. The witches might die, but the logic that killed them was immortal. From that point forward, the trials were unstoppable. The magistrates established a precedent. Confession was currency, and death was proof. Ministers warned that the devil grew stronger with every denial. The afflicted girls became stars of the courtroom, their every gesture treated as divine evidence. All of it, the screams, the prayers, the gallows, began with those first names. Tituba, Sarah, Good, Sarah, Osborne. The choice of victims was not random. It followed the same cruel rhythm seen throughout history. Punish the powerless, sanctify the accusers, call it righteousness. By the time Salem realized what it had done, it was too late. But that reckoning belongs to another chapter. For now, the town had found its villains, its heroes, and its holy war. The stage was set. The players were chosen. The tragedy had begun. The trials might have stayed small, 3 names. A few hearings if not for one decision that turned rumor into authority. The judges began to accept something called spectral evidence. It meant that visions, dreams, or invisible attacks could be treated as proof. If someone swore they saw your ghost tormenting them at night, that was enough to destroy you in daylight. It sounds absurd now, but to the people of Salem, it felt logical. They believed the devil could take on the shape of an innocent person to carry out harm, but only with that person's permission. So if a witness saw your spirit in a nightmare, it must mean you had made a pact. The courtroom became a theater of imagination, half prayer meeting, half performance. The afflicted girls writhed, screamed, and claimed to see specters floating above the accused. Judges nodded, scribes wrote, and the audience gasped. Fear became evidence. Performance became fact. In the early spring of 1692, the trials grew louder. What began in the meeting house spilled into the streets. The names of the accused multiplied, first a handful, then dozens. The more the girls pointed, the more power they gained, and the more people believed them. The court, overwhelmed, stopped questioning whether witchcraft existed. Its only task now was to identify the guilty. Every trial followed the same grim rhythm. The afflicted entered trembling, hands clutched to their chests. The accused stood pale and bewildered, surrounded by whispers. A judge would ask, "Do you torment these children?" And before they could answer, the girls would fall to the ground, convulsing, shouting that the spirit of the accused was choking them. The crowd gasped. The judges leaned forward. It was theater disguised as justice. And the worst part, the system rewarded participation. If you confessed, you might live. If you refused, you would die. So people began to confess not because they were guilty, but because they were desperate. They named others, spreading guilt like infection. The court praised them for their honesty, calling it repentance. Each confession created new suspects, and each new suspect reinforced the illusion that witchcraft was everywhere. The social map of Salem redrew itself. The accused were almost always poor, female, or disliked. Those with grudges finally found divine permission to settle them. A dispute over fences could now be holy warfare. A rejected suitor could call it vengeance from heaven. For once, the powerless held the power to destroy, and the powerful had the means to justify it. The court's records grew thick with testimony. Floating spectres, biting shadows, books signed in blood. People claimed to see ghosts of victims demanding justice, animals talking in human voices, invisible hands lifting tools. The line between truth and imagination was gone. Even the judges began to dream of witches. They woke, terrified, certain the devil was testing them too. By June, the hysteria had its first execution. Bridget Bishop, a tavern owner who wore bright clothing and spoke her mind, was accused of bewitching men with her scarlet bodice and her laughter. She had been tried once before for witchcraft years earlier, which sealed her fate. Her trial was brief, her death swift. On June 10, she was hanged on Gallows Hill while the villagers prayed for her soul and congratulated themselves for defending God's kingdom. Her execution did not calm the panic, it fed it. People said that when she died, a strange wind passed through the crowd, proof that her spirit had fled to serve the devil. After that, the hangings came regularly. Each new death was described as a victory for the Lord. By midsummer, the courtroom overflowed. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators. Women clutched Bibles to their chests. Men nodded solemnly as the afflicted girls screamed. The judges had grown confident, their pens quick, their verdicts quicker. The gallows became a familiar shape on the horizon. Salem's jail, built for a handful of thieves, now held nearly 200 accused witches. Families sold land to pay jail fees. Husbands begged ministers to spare their wives. Children slept alone while their mothers waited for trial. The guards grew cruel, mocking the prisoners. Rats scurried through straw. Some captives sang hymns in the dark, trying to remind themselves of a God who still listened. Among them was Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, known for her kindness and piety. Her trial drew special attention because she did not fit the image of a witch. For a moment, it looked like reason might win. She was found not guilty. But the afflicted girls screamed again, claiming her spirit had attacked them in court. Pressured by public outrage, the judges reversed their decision. She was executed in July. That reversal broke something deeper than law. It broke faith and mercy. If even Rebecca Nurse could hang, no one was safe. Yet the trials continued. The ministers preached obedience, the judges prayed for clarity, and the villagers whispered about who might be next. Outside the courtroom, Salem was collapsing. Fields went untended. Livestock died. Children starved. People were too afraid to trade or visit neighbors. The town's energy, once spent on survival, now fed the machinery of accusation. Every sermon began and ended with warnings about hidden sin. Every tragedy became proof that the devil still worked among them. Some people began to doubt, quietly. A few ministers warned against spectral evidence, arguing that the devil could use innocent shapes. One even wrote, "It were better that 10 witches escape than that one innocent person perish." But in the fever of righteousness, doubt sounded like betrayal. Those who spoke cautiously soon stopped speaking at all. The trials became self-sustaining. Accusers gained fame. The court gained authority. The village gained purpose. Hysteria had turned into governance. Fear had become the new order. By the end of summer, Even the ocean breeze that once cooled Salem seemed to carry whispers of guilt. Gallows Hill loomed like a sermon carved into stone. The villagers could see it from their windows, a daily reminder that evil had a face, and that face might one day be their own. That is the cruel symmetry of panic. It promises safety, but delivers submission. The people of Salem thought they were cleansing their town. In truth, they were building a cage, and every name they added to the list made its bars stronger. Spectral evidence gave them permission to believe the impossible, to turn nightmares into trials, and suspicion into salvation. Once you allow imagination to sit in judgment, no one can be acquitted. And still, no one asked the most obvious question, the one that would have stopped it all. What if the devil's trick was not to hide in the accused, but to hide in the accusers? By then, it was too late. The machinery of faith and fear had fused. The people of Salem had become their own proof. By the spring of 1692, Salem's fear had grown too large for gossip to contain. It needed structure, rules, judges, a seal of authority. So, the colonial government created the Court of Oyer and Terminer, Latin, for to hear and determine. The name sounded dignified. Its purpose was anything but. It was built to process witches. The man who oversaw it, William Stoughton, was no villain in his own eyes. He was a devout Puritan, stern and logical, convinced that law and scripture were one. To him, eradicating witchcraft was not cruelty, it was service to God. The governor, Sir William Phipps, trusted him completely. Fear had found its administrator. The courtroom itself was small, dark, and always crowded. People pressed against the walls, craning to see the faces of the accused. The air reeked of sweat and candle smoke. Outside, carts creaked under the weight of more prisoners, their chains clinking softly like broken prayers. Inside, judges sat at a long wooden table, their quills poised like weapons. From the first session, the tone was clear. The court did not question whether witchcraft existed. It assumed its only task was to expose the guilty. Spectral evidence, already poisoning the town, was now enshrined in law. Dreams were admissible, visions considered fact. The afflicted girls, once children trembling in corners, now held power that eclipsed men twice their age. Their screams could end lives. Witnesses described seeing the specters of neighbors flying through the night, signing Satan's book, or sending invisible beasts to attack the faithful. Each story was recorded in neat handwriting, sealed with official wax, and treated as truth. The machinery of faith had become paperwork. At the center sat Stoughton, cold and meticulous. He believed doubt was the devil's whisper. When a woman wept and swore she was innocent, he saw not tragedy, but cunning. Why should the devil torment his own servants? He asked. Every denial became confirmation. The court's first major case was Bridget Bishop, and her hanging had only strengthened its confidence. By June, dozens stood accused. Trials ran long into the night. People collapsed from exhaustion, yet no one dared leave before the verdicts were read. A single raised eyebrow could be misread as sympathy for witches. The ministers, divided but cautious, sent letters urging moderation. Even Cotton Mather, a respected theologian, warned that spectral evidence was unreliable. But his father, Increase Mather, added a line that undercut it all. It were better that 10 witches escape than that one innocent person perish. Few listened. In a storm of conviction, reason sounds like weakness. The process became chillingly efficient. An accusation was made, an arrest followed, and within days the accused stood before the judges. Bail was rare. Lawyers were forbidden. Testimonies came from neighbors, children, and the afflicted. The accused were often confused, frightened, unable to follow the questions thrown at them. The judges asked if they had seen the devil, if they had signed a book, if they had hurt the girls. Denial brought screams from the afflicted, and the court took that as proof. One observer later wrote that the trials felt like madness, given uniform. Everyone played their part perfectly, the judges firm, the girls dramatic, the accused doomed. The gallows worked like clockwork, and the prayers at each execution blurred into one long chant. Still, there were cracks. A few brave souls tried to speak. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister, stood accused by several witnesses who claimed he had supernatural strength. In court, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something witches were supposedly unable to do. The crowd hesitated. For a moment, belief wavered. Then Stoughton stepped forward and declared that even the devil could disguise holiness. The hangman pulled the lever. With each death, the court grew bolder. It saw itself as a sword of divine justice, slicing through sin. But outside the walls, the town was rotting. Crops wilted, children went hungry, and men avoided their fields for fear of leaving their families unprotected. The jails were so full that prisoners were chained to floors, unable to lie down. Some starved. Others fell ill and died before trial. Letters began to arrive from Boston and beyond, questioning the legitimacy of the court. How can invisible evidence be proved? One minister asked. But Salem, drunk on its righteousness, answered only with more executions. As summer deepened, the court expanded its reach. Villages miles away, Andover, Topsfield, Ipswich sent in their own accused. The panic had become regional. It was no longer about Salem's sins, it was about New England's soul. The Puritans had built their colony to be a new Jerusalem, pure and uncorrupted. Now they were purging it by their own hands. Behind closed doors, even some of the judges began to lose sleep. They dreamed of the faces they had condemned. One later confessed he feared that in trying to destroy witchcraft, they had served it instead, but none spoke openly. Silence, after all, had become the town's second language. The court's work was methodical. Names were recorded, property seized, and executions scheduled. Families of the condemned were billed for chains and rope. The economy of fear was complete. Death had become a business. By August, more than 100 people were in jail. 19 would hang. One man, Giles Corey, would be pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to plead. His last words, more weight, echoed like defiance carved in stone. Even as his ribs cracked, he refused to feed the machinery with false confession. Outside the courtroom, the forests whispered their indifference. The same wind that had carried prayers now carried ashes. Children grew used to the sound of weeping. Ministers preached that the trials were proof of God's vigilance, but privately some began to pray for them to end. The Puritans had fled Europe to escape religious tyranny. Now they had built their own. The Court of Oyer and Terminer did not just formalize the hysteria, it institutionalized it. Fear became law, and law became faith. Every signature on a death warrant was written with trembling conviction and the quiet terror of being next. It would take another season, another round of executions, and one final, unthinkable accusation for the tide to turn. But for now, in the summer of 1692, Salem was a perfect theocracy, orderly, obedient, and drowning in its own righteousness. By late summer, the executions had become routine. The same hill, the same rope, the same prayer murmured before the drop. Gallows Hill stood like a black tooth against the sky, and the town gathered below as if for church. Mothers clutched children who peered wide-eyed at the hanging bodies swaying in the wind. Each death was meant to cleanse the community. Instead, it stained it deeper. 19 people were hanged that year. Most were women, but a few men joined them: farmers, ministers, even pillars of the congregation. Each execution came with a sermon. The ministers told the villagers they were defending purity, but the prayers sounded hollow against the creak of rope. When Bridget Bishop had died first, people whispered that her bright clothes had tempted the devil. When Rebecca Nurse followed, the whisper changed. Perhaps goodness itself could be deceptive. The logic twisted until it devoured itself. In August, George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village, was led to the scaffold. He prayed aloud and recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something witches were said to be unable to do. The crowd hesitated. For a moment, the spell of fear broke. Then one of the magistrates shouted that even Satan could mimic piety. The hangman finished his work, and the crowd fell silent. As the bodies multiplied, so did the doubt. Families began to whisper that maybe something was wrong, but silence was safer than speech. The moment anyone questioned the trials, suspicion turned toward them. Fear had become self-sustaining. To survive it, you had to feed it. The trials dragged on through the heat of summer and into the chill of autumn. The jails overflowed. Women gave birth in chains. Men starved in darkness while their land was seized to pay court fees. Neighbors bought the property of the condemned at low prices, telling themselves they were only helping maintain order. Even children were locked away. Sarah Good's little daughter, barely 5, remained in prison for months. She would never again sleep through the night. Then came the death of Giles Corey, the old farmer who refused to plead. The court needed a confession to proceed, and he would not give them one. So they laid him in an open field, placed boards upon his chest, and stacked stones on top. Each time they urged him to speak, he only muttered, "More weight." When he finally died, the townspeople called it justice, but his defiance outlived him. It was the first crack in the wall. As the executions continued, the governor's own wife was accused. That accusation changed everything. Suddenly the hysteria reached too high. If the wife of a governor could be a witch, then no one was safe, not even the powerful who had fanned the flames. Governor Phipps, embarrassed and alarmed, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court was formed, one that quietly rejected spectral evidence. By the time the gallows fell silent, 20 people were dead. Dozens more rotted in cells. Their health broken. Their families ruined. When the new court began to release prisoners, no one celebrated. The town was hollowed out. The fields lay untended, the harvest spoiled. Salem's streets were filled with widows and orphans, its churches half empty. The ministers spoke of repentance, but the words came too late. Reverend Paris, whose own daughter had begun the storm, stood in the pulpit one October morning and confessed that mistakes had been made. He asked for forgiveness. The congregation stared back, unmoving. His prayers, once so loud, now sounded small. Within a year, he would leave Salem, never to return. Some of the judges wrote letters begging God's mercy. Judge Sewall stood before his church and publicly confessed guilt, asking for the congregation's prayers. Others, like Stoughton, never apologized. They claimed they had only followed the evidence given, but evidence had become another word for fear. The survivors carried the memory like a curse. Children who had watched the hangings grew into adults who avoided the hill. Families of the condemned could not find buyers for their land. The ghosts of the trials lingered not as specters, but as silence, a silence that settled into the soil. Years later, when the colony tried to make amends, it could offer only money. The government paid reparations to some of the victims' families, but no amount could buy back faith. The Puritans had built their world on the promise of order, sin punished, virtue rewarded. The trials proved the opposite, that goodness could die on the same rope as guilt, and that even prayer could be twisted into cruelty. The last prisoner was released in 1693. The town tried to move on, but the stain never washed out. When new settlers arrived, they avoided the story, as if refusing to name it might make it vanish. But the past does not dissolve. It settles layer by layer, until one day a child asks why the ground on the hill is so uneven. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials were not just a tragedy of superstition. They were a mirror held up to human certainty, proof of how easily morality turns murderous when doubt is forbidden. The people of Salem believed they were defending truth. Instead, they buried it. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees on Gallows Hill, some said they could still hear the creak of rope and the faint echo of a prayer that was never answered. By the time the court reached full swing, the pattern of accusation was no longer random. It reflected the invisible map of Salem, the fault lines of gender, class, and old resentment. The accused were rarely the powerful. They were the poor, the outspoken, the inconvenient. Fear, once unleashed, followed the same social gravity as everything else. It rolled downhill. Most of the accused were women. That was no accident. In Puritan New England, a woman's worth was tied to obedience, first to God, then to husband, then to the church. A good woman was silent, pious, and useful. A difficult one, who spoke her mind or owned land, unsettled the order. And when fear demanded names, such women were the easiest to name. Their independence looked like defiance, their grief like guilt. Some widows owned property that neighbors coveted. Others had survived multiple marriages, an anomaly in a world where misfortune itself could be evidence of sin. A woman who lost 2 husbands might be whispered about as unlucky. Add a failed crop or a quarrel, and suddenly her bad luck had a supernatural cause. Men were accused too, but usually through proximity. Husbands of accused wives, fathers of afflicted girls, ministers whose sermons failed to calm the storm. Their guilt was borrowed, their trials public. But for women, guilt was personal, woven into the fabric of how society saw them. The social tension between Salem village and Salem town deepened the divide. The village, poorer and more religious, resented the town's wealth and trade. Many of the early accusers came from families who felt looked down upon by those closer to the coast. The witch trials gave them a strange form of revenge, a way to invert the hierarchy, if only briefly. For the first time, the powerless could summon the powerful to answer them. The Putnams were central to this divide. Thomas Putnam, a wealthy but embittered farmer, had long been at odds with several of the accused. Land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and political feuds all found their way into testimony. His daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., was one of the most vocal accusers. Her visions always seemed to target her father's enemies. No one pointed that out aloud. In Salem, coincidence had become confession. It is hard to overstate how intertwined faith and social standing were. To miss church was to risk suspicion. To prosper too much was also suspicious, perhaps the devil's favor. Puritan life allowed little room for nuance. Misfortune or success could both look unnatural in the right light. That ambiguity gave fear endless fuel. Even within families, distrust took root. A husband could denounce his wife to save himself. A child could accuse a parent, believing they were saving their own soul. Confession became currency. Betrayal, survival. The witch trials taught people to weaponize virtue. Every act of accusation could be disguised as obedience to God. The courtroom mirrored this inversion perfectly. The judges, all men of standing, interrogated women who trembled before them. Their voices were treated as moral instruments. Each denial was recast as deceit. A woman's silence was cunning, her tears manipulation. The more she wept, the more convinced the judges became that Satan had her tongue. Mercy was redefined as punishment. The gallows became a kind of moral theater, reaffirming who held authority and who did not. But something subtler worked beneath the surface, the exhaustion of living in a society that demanded perfection. Every sermon warned that sin could hide anywhere, even in a thought. Everyone had something to fear, something to hide. The witch trials gave that pressure an outlet. If you could point to a witch, you could momentarily stop wondering if you were one. The trials became a moral mirror that reflected the villagers' insecurities. The men accused of witchcraft were often those who challenged ministerial authority or showed skepticism toward the trials. Doubt itself had become heresy. The women accused were those who did not fit neatly into the mold: midwives, healers, widows, or women who dared to argue with their neighbors. In a world that prized conformity, individuality looked demonic. As the executions multiplied, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The people dying were not strangers or villains. They were the same ones who had helped deliver babies, shared bread, nursed the sick. The town was killing its caretakers. And yet, every new hanging brought a strange calm, as if the village could breathe again, briefly fooled into thinking the disease had been cut out. Those who had benefited from the hysteria, the accusers, the opportunists, the property buyers, began to feel the weight of their choices. The devil they had feared no longer lived in shadows. He lived in their own hunger for safety, for order, for someone to blame. The trials had started as a war against evil, but had turned into a mirror of their own despair. Outside Salem, the rest of Massachusetts watched with growing unease. Ministers and scholars in Boston wrote that Satan's greatest trick might be to make good men do his work under the banner of righteousness. The more Salem tried to purify itself, the more corrupt it became. Even the children sensed it. The same girls who had once screamed in court now avoided one another, their friendship fractured by guilt. Their voices had made them powerful. Their silence made them ghosts. By winter, the fever began to fade. The snow returned, and with it, quiet. But the town was no longer the same. Families sat across from empty chairs at supper. Neighbors passed without speaking. Every field seemed to hold a memory. The structure of power remained, but the moral certainty that had built it was gone. Salem had turned its own social order inside out and found nothing at the center but fear. Women who had no voice were silenced again, this time by ropes. Men who thought themselves righteous learned how easily righteousness can rot. And the church that once promised salvation now stood as a monument to hysteria dressed in holy language. The witch trials had begun as an attempt to restore purity. In the end, they revealed a truth no one wanted to see, that fear needs no witches to survive. It only needs a crowd, a cause, and a court willing to listen. By the autumn of 1692, Salem's fever had begun to turn against itself. The town that had once shouted witch with such certainty now whispered it like a curse it wished it could take back. The gallows still stood, but fewer people came to watch. The air had changed. The executions no longer felt like victories. They felt like funerals no one wanted to claim. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly. The first doubts crept in through those who had the most to lose. Ministers, magistrates, even members of the jury. Some of the afflicted girls began to waver. Their fits grew less convincing. Their stories tangled. The same gestures that once drew gasps now drew silence. People began to look away instead of cheering. Then came the accusation that shattered the illusion entirely. In October, the girls accused Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's own wife. It was as if the fire they would built had finally turned toward the house of its keepers. Governor William Phipps, horrified, acted swiftly. Within days, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the very institution he had created. In its place, he established a new court that quietly discarded spectral evidence, the foundation of every conviction. That decision was more than a legal change. It was an unspoken confession. The government no longer believed in the world it had built. Those still imprisoned waited, thin and sick, for their fates to change. One by one, they were released. Some walked out barefoot, unable to remember sunlight. Others left only to find their homes sold, their families scattered. For many, freedom was just another kind of exile. The town that had condemned them could not look them in the eye. The ministers tried to reclaim control of the story. They preached that the trials had been a necessary test of faith, a lesson in vigilance. But the words rang hollow. Too many graves stood between sermon and listener. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose household had sparked it all, faced growing anger. Parishioners refused to attend his sermons. Some demanded his resignation. His prayers could not fill the silence he had helped create. Within months, he fled Salem, leaving behind a pulpit that no one wanted to inherit. Even the judges were haunted. Samuel Sewall, one of the most respected magistrates, stood in his church a year later and publicly confessed his guilt. He declared a day of fasting and prayer, asking for divine forgiveness for the innocent blood shed. Few others followed. William Stoughton, the chief judge, refused to apologize. To his dying day, he insisted he had served God's will. But the villagers could not unsee what they had done. The same people who once crowded the courtroom now avoided it. The same lips that once shouted accusations now trembled in shame. Salem's streets filled with ghosts, not of witches, but of conscience. The taverns were quiet, the fields untended. The world felt smaller, as if the horizon itself had moved inward. When the new court, led by Governor Phipps, began reviewing the evidence, most cases collapsed instantly. Without spectral testimony, there was nothing left to hold them up. The witchcraft dissolved like fog under sun. In May 1693, Phipps released the last prisoners and declared the trials over. The devil had left Salem, they said, but not in the way they thought. Years later, the colony tried to atone. The government paid reparations to survivors and families of the dead. They issued formal pardons, but no one could restore what had been lost. The friendships broken, the children orphaned, the trust that once held a fragile town together. Money could not quiet the echo of rope or erase the smell of fear baked into every beam of the meeting house. The greatest irony was that the trials ended not because of revelation, but exhaustion. The people had simply run out of faith in their own fear. The human body cannot live forever on terror. The villagers began to crave silence, normalcy, the rhythm of ordinary sin, the kind that did not require gallows to cure. Salem's repentance was slow, uneven, and half-hearted. Some still whispered that witches had walked among them. Others, too proud to admit error, claimed the executions had been divinely ordained. But beneath those words, a deeper awareness grew, that they had been caught in something larger than religion, larger than law. They had glimpsed how easily the machinery of righteousness could grind the innocent to dust. The surviving girls, those who had cried out in court, grew into women who carried the weight of their voices for the rest of their lives. And Putnam Muir, one of the most fervent accusers, eventually stood before her church and begged forgiveness, saying she had been deluded by Satan. It was an admission the others never made, but it spoke for all of them. The aftermath left Salem hollow but human again. The town began to rebuild, not from conviction, but from fatigue. The people who remained wanted no more talk of devils or saints. They wanted crops that grew, children who laughed, and nights without screams. But the story did not vanish. Salem's name would travel farther than its people ever could carried on sermons, letters, and books. It became a warning, a parable whispered whenever belief turned blind. Generations later, writers and thinkers would return to it, using its ashes to talk about politics, hysteria, and the dangers of moral certainty. The trials had begun with faith and ended with silence. In between lay the full measure of human weakness, the need to blame, to belong, to believe at any cost. When the storm finally broke, Salem stood blinking in the light, not purified but exposed. The Puritans had imagined themselves as builders of a new Eden. Instead, they had recreated the oldest story in the world, people so afraid of evil that they became it. And so the last hanging tree stood on Gallows Hill until it rotted, the rope long gone, but its shadow intact. The land was tilled again, houses built nearby. Children played where bodies had once swung, but when the wind blew through the grass, it sounded like whispering, as if the ground itself remembered. When the trials ended, Salem did not rejoice. There were no public celebrations, no proclamations of relief, only the slow, awkward quiet of a place that had lost its own reflection. People returned to their fields, but the earth seemed different, as if every furrow hid a memory. The children played again, but they avoided the hill. The prayers in church were shorter, quieter. No one dared to ask why God had allowed it, because deep down they feared the answer. He had not. For the survivors, the return to ordinary life was almost impossible. The accused who were freed came home to find their houses ransacked, their animals gone, their neighbors avoiding them. Some were forced to beg from the same villagers who had testified against them. Others left Salem entirely, vanishing into other towns where no one would recognize their names. Forgiveness was a word people spoke but did not mean. Those who had lost family members carried their absence like a second shadow. Widows of the executed were forbidden to inherit their husband's land, because by law, traitors could not pass property. Children of the condemned grew up marked by the same shame their parents had died under. In a society built on reputation, theirs had been erased. One boy, whose mother was hanged, was taunted for years by other children who hissed the word witch whenever he passed. Salem's soil had been salted with blame. Reverend Paris stayed in the pulpit for a little while, but the congregation thinned. The same people who once looked to him for answers now looked through him. When he spoke of redemption, they heard only excuses. When he read scripture, his voice shook. Within months, he resigned and disappeared from public life. His name became shorthand for hypocrisy. The ministers who had supported the trials tried to rewrite their roles. Some claimed they had doubted from the start. Others framed the panic as a divine test. The truth was simpler. No one wanted to be the villain in the story history was beginning to tell. The judges who had sentenced the innocent tried to hide behind law and duty, insisting they had done what any godly man would do. But conscience does not dissolve under doctrine. The night stayed long. Judge Samuel Sewall's confession in 1697 became the colony's first public apology. He stood in church while a minister read his statement aloud. He bowed his head, trembling, as the congregation prayed for his forgiveness. He spent the rest of his life in acts of penance, fasting, giving to the poor, writing about the moral dangers of pride. Yet even his humility could not erase the image of the gallows. That tree had grown in his handwriting. Governor Phipps, who had once encouraged the trials, now treated them as a political embarrassment. He banned further arrests and ordered compensation for some families. The colony formally declared a day of fasting and reflection, meant to lament the errors and misfortunes of the past year. But even repentance came divided. The wealthy mourned their loss of moral certainty. The poor mourned their dead. The irony was brutal. A town that had destroyed itself trying to prove its innocence now struggled to prove its guilt. No one wanted to claim ownership of the horror, yet everyone had taken part in it. The afflicted girls were never punished. Most faded into obscurity, marrying and leaving Salem behind. Only Ann Putnam Jr. returned 20 years later to beg public forgiveness. In front of her congregation, she confessed that she had been deluded by Satan, that she had caused the deaths of innocent people through ignorance and fear. Her words trembled, but she spoke them to the end. The congregation listened in silence. No one interrupted. When she finished, she sat down, and the church remained still for a long time. But guilt never stays contained. It seeps into stories, into language, into how a community understands itself. Salem became a cautionary tale within a single generation. Parents told their children to beware of false witness. Ministers used the trials as proof that even the righteous could lose their way. But beneath the moral lessons, there was a deeper wound, the loss of faith, not in God, but in people. The town fractured. Some moved away, starting over in quieter places. Others stayed, too poor or too proud to leave. They rebuilt the meeting house, planted new crops, and tried to live as though the past had been a fever dream. But every sound, every hammer on wood, every sermon in the air seemed to echo what had come before. The more they tried to forget, the more the silence grew heavy. Outside Massachusetts, the trials became an embarrassment for the Puritan experiment. The city, upon a hill, meant to be a model of moral perfection, had revealed the dangers of its own purity. Intellectuals and preachers in Europe cited Salem as proof that excessive zeal corrupts judgment. What had been divine authority now looked like fanaticism. The word witch itself began to lose its terror, replaced by another hysteria. Years later, long after the gallows were gone and the last witness had died, the government issued official pardons. The list was long, and the ink trembled. Where clerks wrote names no one dared to say aloud for decades. But time does not forgive, it forgets. And forgetting is never clean. Salem's descendants learned to live with the paradox. They were both heirs to faith and children of fear. The landscape changed, the people changed, but the story stayed. Travelers would come through and ask where the witches had been hanged. Locals pointed vaguely to the north, unwilling to be exact. Tourists came for curiosity. The villagers came for silence. In the centuries that followed, the story of Salem became less about witchcraft and more about belief itself, the thin line between devotion and delusion. Writers would turn it into allegory, politicians into warning, psychologists into study. But beneath all the analysis, the raw truth remained. People killed their neighbors because they needed to feel safe. Even now, the story lingers, not because of its horror, but because it is so recognizably human. The same hunger for certainty, the same fear of chaos, still beats quietly under modern skin. Salem's ghosts do not haunt through superstition, they whisper through repetition. Every time fear becomes virtue, every time judgment feels like righteousness, the ground remembers. In 1706, and Putnam's apology closed the book on Salem in the colony's eyes. But the story never really ended. It moved into the collective memory, a lesson carved out of grief. The people of Salem never rebuilt a monument for the accused. The monument was the absence itself, the unspoken agreement that what happened there should never happen again. The trials had shown how fragile truth becomes when tied to power, how easily morality turns into weaponry. The aftermath proved something harder, that even remorse has limits. Salem could repent, but it could not undo. And so, in the years after the gallows rotted and the confessions faded, the town carried on, ploughing fields, raising families, tending graves. Life returned, but innocence did not. The devil they had feared was gone, but what remained was worse, the knowledge that they had never needed him to begin with. Centuries later, people still look back at Salem and ask the same question. Why? How could a community of intelligent, devout, hard-working people lose themselves so completely? The search for answers has become its own kind of ritual, part history, part therapy. For generations, the simplest explanation was faith gone wrong. The Puritans we said, were too strict, too frightened of sin, too obsessed with control. They lived inside a pressure cooker of morality, and the lid finally blew. There is truth in that, but it is not the whole story. Fear alone does not build gallows. Fear needs structure, and Salem had plenty. Historians began to see the trials not as madness, but as the logical conclusion of a society built on anxiety. The colony was new, unstable, surrounded by wilderness and war. Epidemics had killed loved ones. Land disputes tore neighbors apart. The government had been dissolved and rewritten. The villagers were clinging to something solid, and the only thing that still felt solid was belief. When the ground beneath them shifted, they blamed the invisible. Modern psychology added another layer. The afflicted girls, Betty, Abigail, Anne, Mercy, were young, powerless, and constantly watched. Their world offered no outlet for emotion except prayer. To tremble, to scream, to speak forbidden words was rebellion disguised as possession. Hysteria became a language they could use without punishment. And once that language gained attention, it spread like song, irresistible, contagious, destructive. Other scholars tried to find a physical cause. In the 1,970 seconds, a theory emerged that the girls had suffered from ergot poisoning, a fungal infection in rye that can cause convulsions and hallucinations. The idea fascinated the public. Maybe the devil had been in the bread all along, but the evidence never held. The symptoms did not match, and the panic's precision, its politics, its timing was too deliberate for mold. The truth, it seemed, was not in the grain. It was in the mind. Sociologists later pointed to power. Salem's hierarchy had been crumbling. The witch trials gave men like Stoughton and Paris a stage to reaffirm control. It gave the poor a way to strike back, the rich a way to purify their image, and the church a way to remind everyone who still held the keys to heaven. In that light, witchcraft was less about religion and more about social engineering fear as infrastructure. And yet, the story still resists tidy explanation. The more we analyze it, the more it slips through our fingers. Perhaps that is the real power of Salem. It reveals not one truth, but a pattern. Every generation finds its own reflection in it. In the 19th century, writers turned it into moral warning. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of one of the judges, wrote of guilt passed down like blood. In the 20th, playwrights like Arthur Miller used it to mirror new witch hunts. His The Crucible transformed the trials into an allegory for political persecution. During the Red Scare of the 1,950 seconds, American citizens were accused of un-American beliefs with the same certainty, the same theater, the same terror. Salem's ghosts had learned to speak modern English. Later, historians began to see the trials as a lens for understanding all kinds of collective fear, from mass panics to misinformation. The psychology has not changed. An unexplained event meets a frightened population, authority validates the fear, and suddenly belief becomes weapon. The tools have evolved: newspapers, radios, algorithms, but the rhythm is identical. Salem simply used sermons instead of screens. What makes the story still sting is its ordinariness. The villagers were not monsters. They were us, minus electricity. They prayed, worked, loved, and still needed someone to blame when life refused to make sense. They built a theology sturdy enough to justify cruelty, and once it was built, They could not dismantle it without collapsing their own world. The witch trials were not a detour from civilization. They were one of its recurring roots. Even now, psychologists use Salem as a case study in mass psychogenic illness, how emotions spread faster than logic. Fear, after all, is communal. One person's trembling can make an entire room shake. In Salem, the room was a village. Today, it can be a continent. But for all the analysis, there is something hauntingly poetic about what happened there. The people of Salem believed that evil had slipped among them, invisible and unstoppable. In trying to root it out, they proved themselves right, but not in the way they expected. The devil they hunted was real, but it had no horns, no tail. It lived quietly in every heart that preferred certainty to compassion. That realization did not come quickly. It took centuries for the story to settle into wisdom instead of wound. Even now, when tourists visit the memorial stones, the names carved there feel both distant and familiar. Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs. They are less ghosts than reminders that justice built on fear will always find someone to hang. In the 1,990 seconds, the state of Massachusetts officially cleared all remaining victims of the witch trials. It was a bureaucratic gesture, centuries late, but it mattered. It meant the record was finally whole, that every condemned name had been restored to the living. Yet even in that act of closure, there was unease. The apologies could fix paper, not memory. The story had already done its work. Salem, in the modern mind, has become shorthand for moral panic, a symbol of how good intentions can rot into cruelty. The same mechanism appears in every era. The rumor that grows too fast to catch, the crowd that confuses outrage with virtue, the authority that chooses fear because fear is easier to manage than thought. And so the witch trials keep repeating themselves, in new disguises, in headlines, in hashtags, in quiet offices, where reputations die in whispers. The costumes change, the script does not. Modern Salem is a tourist town now. You can walk down Essex Street and see stores selling broomsticks and crystals, postcards with cartoon witches, candle shops built over the ghosts of cellars. The town has learned to live with its past by commercializing it, turning tragedy into theater once again. But beneath the neon signs and Halloween laughter, the ground still hums with something old. If you stand at the memorial on Charter Street and read the engraved names at dusk, the air feels strangely still. The stones are simple, just names, dates, final words. One reads, "I am innocent." Another, "God knows I am clear." Nothing more. No sermons, no explanations. Just the stubborn dignity of people who refuse to surrender their truth to hysteria. That is what endures, not the panic, but the defiance. Salem's true legacy is not the madness. It is the reminder that reason is fragile, and that courage, when it comes, often arrives too late. We keep studying the trials because we recognize ourselves in them. Because we know that fear dressed as virtue still walks among us. Because, somewhere deep down, we suspect that the line between faith and frenzy is thinner than we would like to believe. And maybe that is the point of remembering. Not to judge, but to stay awake. Centuries have passed, yet Salem's shape keeps reappearing. The faces change, the tools evolve, but the rhythm remains the same. Every generation finds its own witch hunt, not with cauldrons and charms, but with headlines, courtrooms, and public shaming. The mechanism is timeless, Uncertainty breeds fear, fear demands blame, and authority gives it language. You can see it in every era. The McCarthy hearings in the 1,950 seconds. Neighbours, accusing neighbours of communist ties, careers destroyed over whispers. The logic was identical, invisible evil hiding in plain sight, patriotism as proof of purity. In those rooms, as in Salem, fear dressed itself in moral duty. People convinced themselves they were saving the country, not strangling it. The flags were different. The prayers were the same. The pattern returned again, in subtler forms in moral panics, about art, youth, technology, and identity. In the 1,980 seconds, America saw the satanic panic, where daycare workers were accused of ritual abuse with no evidence beyond frightened children and media echo. Salem had become cable-ready. Talk shows replaced pulpits, but the cadence of outrage was familiar. Protect the innocent, punish the unseen. The internet only made the machinery faster. Where the Puritans used sermons, we use posts. A single accusation can now spread through millions of eyes in an hour. The crowd's roar still feels righteous, even when it is wrong. We have learned to condemn in public before understanding in private. The scaffold is now digital, but it serves the same function to purify the community by spectacle. Salem survives, not as a relic, but as an algorithm. The need to name an enemy never vanished. It just became easier to automate. We do not call it witchcraft anymore. We call it cancel culture, moral outrage, defending values. The words are modern, the instincts ancient. The desire to belong, to prove goodness, to fear isolation. These are the real devils. They have always known our language. The tragedy of Salem was not belief in magic. It was belief in certainty. Once people are sure they are right, they stop listening. In 1692, that certainty wore black robes and scripture. Today, it wears hashtags and outrage. But the result is the same, the innocent crushed under the weight of everyone's need to be pure. Historians used to treat Salem as a cautionary episode in early American superstition, something we would outgrown. But every new panic proves otherwise. Fear does not punish, it adapts. It slips into whatever moral framework a culture builds. It speaks the local dialect, and because it speaks in the tone of virtue, it is hard to tell apart from goodness until it is too late. There is also the quieter version, the one inside individuals. Salem shows what happens when conscience is outsourced, when morality depends entirely on belonging. The villagers did not kill out of hatred alone. They killed because they were afraid of standing alone against the crowd. Their silence was their shield, and their shield became a weapon. That same silence exists now in different rooms, meetings, comment sections, news cycles where doubt feels dangerous. The most frightening part of Salem is not how extraordinary it was, but how ordinary. No monsters, no fanatics, just people, small, devout, tired, making sense of chaos the only way they knew how, by finding someone to blame. And that ordinariness means it can happen anywhere. It already has. That is why the story keeps resurfacing, not because it is unfinished, but because it is ongoing. Salem is a loop, not a chapter. It reappears every time truth becomes less important than belonging, every time we punish doubt instead of listening to it. The witch trials are history's way of asking the same question over and over. When you feel afraid, who do you become? Maybe that is why we keep returning to it in art and memory. Salem is not about witches at all. It is about imagination turned against itself. It is about the human capacity to build cages out of conviction and call them sanctuaries. The people of 1692 did not wake up planning to hang their neighbors. They woke up trying to survive a world they could not control. Fear gave them a story, and they followed it until it led them to the gallows. The pattern endures because the need endures. Fear wants simplicity, and simplicity always demands a scapegoat. Every age picks its own. Sometimes it is a neighbor, sometimes a stranger, sometimes an idea. But the machinery runs the same way. Accusation replaces inquiry. Confession replaces truth, and silence replaces mercy. And yet, there is a kind of fragile hope hidden inside the repetition. Because every time the pattern returns, there are always a few who resist it. In Salem, it was Giles Corey refusing to plead. In McCarthy's era, it was the senators who finally said no. Today, it is anyone who pauses before joining the outrage, who asks for evidence instead of spectacle. Resistance never looks grand in its moment. It looks lonely, uncertain, but it is the only thing that breaks the loop. When you stand at Salem's memorial stones today, it is hard to tell if you are mourning the past or recognizing the present. The names on the granite are old, but the echo in the air feels recent. What died? There was not just reason, it was the courage to doubt. And that courage, even now, is what keeps history from repeating in full. So the story of Salem endures not as a warning from the past, but as a mirror held to the present. It whispers across centuries. This is what fear does when you let it feel holy. And if we listen closely, not just to condemn them, but to understand them, maybe we can finally hear what they could not. That evil does not need magic to thrive. It only needs good people convinced they are right. When the smoke of Salem's gallows finally disappeared, the world did not stop making the same mistake. It simply changed its setting. Every civilization, in its own way, has had its version of the witch trials, moments when logic collapsed, and fear borrowed the voice of truth. The faces change, but the gesture is familiar, the pointing finger, the bowed head, the crowd's relief at finding someone else to blame. Long before Salem, in ancient Scandinavia, the Vikings told stories of seidr, a kind of forbidden magic practiced mostly by women. Those who mastered it were both feared and needed. They could heal, predict, or curse. The same culture that praised warriors for spilling blood condemned women for wielding unseen power. When something went wrong, a storm, a plague, a loss at sea, it was easier to blame the Seith Kona than to accept that the gods were silent. Salem was not an American invention. It was just America's turn. Centuries later, in Japan, the same current of fear and reverence shaped the legends of Osaka's sieges. There, loyalty became its own kind of religion. Betrayal, real or imagined, was punished with ritual precision. When people live under unbearable pressure to be pure, accusation becomes inevitable. A man's fall is always the crowd's catharsis. Salem and Osaka, though worlds apart, shared a grammar of terror. The belief that safety can be restored only through sacrifice. Even in the ancient world, the pattern was visible. In Babylon, when a building collapsed, the builder was executed, and his body buried beneath the ruins, a grim proof that guilt must have flesh. The logic was comforting. Misfortune is never random. Someone must be responsible. It is the same comfort that led Salem's villagers to their neighbors' doors with warrants in hand. Blame is order's last illusion. And then there is Alexander in Babylon, the conqueror surrounded by omens, priests, and prophecies. When his closest friends died, the astrologers whispered that he had angered the gods. Power and paranoia danced together until even his victories tasted like doom. Salem, too, had its prophets and soldiers, preachers who mistook anxiety for revelation, judges who thought mercy would tempt the devil. The difference is scale, not nature. The mechanism is constant. Fear dressed as faith. You can trace the thread through medieval Europe, where entire villages burned because a cow died or a storm struck. You can find it in 20th century revolutions, where enemies of the state replaced witches. You can see it today, glowing behind screens where outrage piles on faster than reflection. The names change, but the fear is the same fear, that evil hides among us, and that we are righteous enough to destroy it. What Salem teaches, when you strip away the superstition, is how easily belief becomes theater. The trials were never about proof. They were about performance. The villagers needed to see evil die, just as ancient warriors needed to see a sacrifice bleed. Without spectacle, fear loses its focus. The crowd's eyes must be fed. In every era, that hunger finds its medium fire, rope, or camera lens. But history also offers small antidotes, fragments of sanity that survive even in madness. The Viking women who kept practicing seether in secret. The Japanese generals who refused to execute prisoners after Osaka's fall. The Babylonian scribes who began recording their doubts in margins. The few Salem villagers who stood up and said, quietly, "This is wrong." Civilization advances, not through triumph, but through the moments when conscience whispers louder than the mob. And so, the Salem story does not end in 1693. It stretches forward, touching every place where fear learns to speak in holy tones. The same current runs through witch hunts and revolutions, inquisitions, and algorithms. It hums beneath any society that mistakes certainty for virtue. That is why each retelling matters. When we revisit Salem not as curiosity, but as mirror, we remember that morality without humility turns cruel, and that truth needs doubt to stay alive. The witches were never real, but the danger was. It still is. Every culture must learn this lesson for itself, again and again. Evil does not enter through dark magic. It enters through self-righteousness. Salem was just one village where that truth became visible long enough for the world to take note. Today, the stones on Gallows Hill sit quiet. The air carries only the rustle of grass and the hum of traffic from the modern town below. Tourists come and go, snapping photos, buying trinkets, laughing nervously as they pose beside plaques. They rarely stay long. But if you stand there alone, after dusk, you can almost feel it, the hum of history repeating itself, soft and endless, not as curse, but as reminder. And so, we come to the end of Salem's long shadow, a story that began with two frightened girls and ended with an entire town learning how fear can speak in the voice of faith. The trials did not vanish with the smoke from Gallows Hill. They slipped quietly into the bloodstream of history. Every age has carried a trace of them. Every time we divide the world into pure and impure, us and them, believer and heretic, Salem breathes again. It is easy to pity the villagers, to see them as trapped in ignorance, swallowed by superstition. But they were only doing what frightened people always do, trying to explain chaos, trying to feel clean again. They built a cage and called it salvation. We build our own, just prettier. Their gallows had rope. Ours have reputation, algorithms, and applause. If there is one lesson left, it is not that they were fools. It is that they were human, and that humanity, without reflection, can be far more dangerous than any myth. Truth is fragile when fear feels holy. Mercy is louder only when someone dares to stop the noise. Salem's story does not end in 1693. It ends every time someone chooses patience over panic, listening over judgment, courage over comfort. Maybe that is how the curse breaks, not with apology, but awareness. So as we close this chapter tonight, take a moment to remember the names carved in stone, the lives taken by certainty, and the silence that followed. Let it remind us that history is not behind us. It is beneath us, waiting for our next decision. Thank you for joining this journey through one of the darkest and most revealing chapters in human history. Until next time, sleep gently, and may your dreams belong only to you.